As most of us know by now, it has been a rough last few days for NASA. We've had the issues with the Starliner all over again, and now the Office of the Inspector General has said that NASA will not be able to realistically return to the moon by 2024, mostly because of budgetary issues with their new spacesuits. So you would wonder why I would be angry about the successful launch of this Antares rocket carrying a Cygnus cargo resupply ship. Shouldn't I be happy about this one positive development? Well, no. You see, the reason why I'm angry about this launch is not because it was successful or anything like that, but because it represents the old way of doing things, an expendable rocket and an expendable vessel. That is what this entire setup is, and there is no plans on the part of Northrop to change it, and that is costing NASA money, lots of money, and consequently, things that require a larger budget, like spacesuits to return to the moon, for example, are coming up short. This needs to stop. So why hasn't it stopped? Why has NASA's policy still been to use things like the Antares and the Cygnus? Is there something about this launch provider or this rocket or something about this particular resupply ship that makes it invaluable to the entire ISS program? Or is it just simply a wasteful and old-fashioned way of doing things? Well, it's a bit of both, actually. You see, in spite of all of the obvious advantages that a reusable cargo ship has, like the Dragon or the upcoming Sierra Nevada Dream Chaser, things like the Cygnus actually still have a few uses and may still be useful as far as NASA is concerned for future missions, at least for the short term. But that doesn't mean that the Antares needs to be used. As a matter of fact, this rocket has no customer whatsoever besides NASA, and it is simply a part of this antiquated and wasteful method of throwing money away that NASA's been using for so long now that simply has to be brought to a stop if we want to return to the moon. So this is why these two incidents are related. We have wasted so much money on things like the Antares and the Cygnus that we're not going back to the moon by 2024. But at the end of the day, how big of a problem is this really? How much money is being wasted every time an Antares gets launched? Because after all, NASA really isn't using it very much anymore. They've got one more launch scheduled for this year and another launch next year. How much money does this really represent as far as waste is concerned, and how much money could be saved by going about things differently? Well, believe it or not, it's a lot more money than you might think, and you're gonna find out just how much this represents and why this pisses me off so much in just a moment. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. So, I have a lot of things to be pissed off about right now. The Starliner is still sitting atop an Atlas V with some of its valves apparently still stuck after all this time that they've been working on it, and they don't appear to have any idea as to how to fix it. Also, NASA has publicly announced what everybody pretty much knew, that they're going to give up on the whole idea of trying to get to the moon by 2024, and that is why I am wearing this shirt. Because, after all, as we all know, nobody does visit anymore. And it still is an open question as to whether or not we will be visiting the moon anytime soon. Well, at least the People's Republic of China has seemed to have a pretty clear idea as to whether or not they're going to be moving forward on that. But our plans are still a bit shaky, I must say, especially given what we insist on continuing to use and the budget that NASA has at its disposal. And so we finally get to the point of the video, what I started off with, which was the successful launch of the Antares and the Cygnus resupply ship. Now, why am I angry about that? Would I have been happier if the thing had blown up on the pad? Well, no, of course not. I never wish that sort of thing on anybody. But still, when it comes down to it, the Antares shouldn't be carrying anything up to the space station anymore. And really, the Cygnus is almost as wasteful. Again, two completely expendable vehicles that we're using to resupply the space station when reusability has been a proven concept now for a number of years, and yet NASA continues to employ companies that are using expendable vehicles. Why does this continue to happen, and why am I wearing a ULA hat when they too are using expendable rockets, and why am I not opening up on them as well? Well, you're going to find all of that out right now. Okay, I know I just repeated myself a couple of times there, and I'm no longer discussing the state of my health or my mental state anymore. Let's just move on. The Antares, what a vehicle. I mean, this is a rocket that's capable of going to space, and it can carry as much as 8 metric tons to low Earth orbit, as opposed to the Falcon 9 that has a payload of 22.8 metric tons. So, okay, it's coming up a bit short as far as payload is concerned. And it was kind of designed for that, really. It's kind of a mid-cargo range carrier that's supposed to be taking up smaller amounts of cargo, whereas the Atlas V carries up the heavier stuff and the Falcon 9. So that all makes sense if the price matched the cargo, which it doesn't. So here's a list of costs for the Antares as of their first completed contract that was published in 2017. First, they got $170 million for completing their previous contract, then $118 million worth of augmented funding by congressional recommendation, whatever the hell that means. Then the CRS-1 contract, the first major cargo contract, that was $1.9 billion. Then the CRS-1 Extension 1, which is $475 million, on top of the CRS-1 Extension 2, which was $725 million. $3.388 million, or rather billion dollars, for 10 flights. 10. And by the way, one of those did this. Okay, Sergey, after watching that absolutely embarrassing and pathetic launch of your Proton rocket, we're going to show you how it's done here in the US of A. You know something, Tovarish? I think you might have a bit of a problem. You know, at least ours had the good sense to come back down as opposed to exploding in midair. That was a little bit more dangerous, I think. Oh, you might want to look out for the shockwave. So what these flights ended up costing NASA in total was about $339 million per flight. And yes, that includes the one that blew up. So how expensive is that compared to what SpaceX costs for the same thing? Well, let's find out. First of all, approximately $396 million in developmental funding since the Falcon 9 was so new at the time, $1.6 billion for the CRS-1 contract, but that was for 12 flights, by the way. The very first part of the contract included 12 cargo flights as opposed to 10. Then CRS-1 Extension 1, which was 3 more Dragon flights for $450 million, and then Extension 2, which was $1.2 billion for 5 Dragon flights. So the total award was actually more, $3.646 billion, but that was for 20 flights. Oh yeah, and by the way, they had a failure as well. The only failure, actually, that the Falcon 9 has sustained thus far in well over 100 launches. So how does all of this break down? Well, the Falcon 9 is costing NASA $182 million per flight for the Cargo Dragon, whereas the Cygnus plus the Antares is running $339 million per flight. And if you drill down into some of these contract extensions, it gets even worse. For example, the Antares CRS-1 Extension 1 of the original contract, and by the way, NASA could have canceled the whole damn thing at this point, cost $475 million for 1 flight. Whereas the same extension for the SpaceX and the Dragon was $450 million for 3 flights. So you're looking at more than triple the cost per flight on the first extension of the contract. And NASA could have told Northrop to take a flying damn leap at this point, but they didn't. Instead, they flushed hundreds of millions of dollars down the toilet for 1 flight. And this is reason enough to get me extremely pissed off, because this was about 300 million wasted dollars. The total amount of money that's been invested in new spacesuits for the Artemis project is about $400 million. It's gone over budget, there's no question about that. But then again, there's also no question that we're going to need spacesuits if we're going to go back to the moon. And also, these spacesuits are, by their very nature, going to be reusable. So once they're bought, they're bought. If we had been able to reallocate this $300 million to spacesuit development, we might be going back to the moon by 2024. And by the way, this is just one example of the money we've wasted on the Antares alone. And by the way, neither NASA nor Northrop nor anybody else revealed the amount of this $475 million ripoff. It had to be dug up from the FAA 2017 annual compendium, and I'm not surprised. If I were NASA, or Northrop for that matter, I certainly wouldn't want to give away this kind of information. This is an absolute ripoff to the American taxpayer and to NASA and to our hopes of going back to the moon. Not something you really want to make public knowledge. And probably the most compelling evidence of just how bad the Antares is the fact that nobody uses it except NASA. The Atlas V, by way of comparison, has carried out missions for many different commercial clients, plus the US military. The Antares, not one launch outside of NASA, for very good reasons. Who the hell wants to pay that kind of price to put a satellite into orbit when you have so many better choices, including things like the Atlas V, which is also expendable, but apparently not as expensive, or at least capable of carrying a hell of a lot more cargo to locations like geosynchronous transfer orbit. But NASA doesn't seem to give a damn about the financial decisions of corporations that actually need to worry about balancing their budget. Instead, they're going to keep going with the Antares for every future Cygnus launch through the end of 2023. Granted, that's not a whole lot of launches. There's only 3 of them coming up. But given the fact that you could be wasting as much as $200 to $300 million a launch, that's still a substantial amount of money that could be well spent elsewhere. Now, the Cygnus is a slightly different story because it can carry double the pressurized volume that the Dragon can. Now, the Dragon has an attached trunk that can carry quite a lot of unpressurized volume, but if you're talking about things that need to be kept in a pressurized environment, foodstuffs, water, that sort of thing. All of these things are important to the ISS, and it's kind of nice to have a vehicle that's capable of carrying double the pressurized volume. Nothing in terms of mass, though. Both the Dragon and the Dream Chaser and the Cygnus can carry about the same amount of mass. It's just the volume that gives the Cygnus that narrow advantage. The big question is, how many of these resupply missions really need that much pressurized volume? Is it really that important? And do we need to be sending these things up this frequently when the Dragon might do the job just as well? Now, another very important use for the Cygnus is to get rid of the ISS's space trash. All of the garbage that the astronauts generate over the course of several months needs to go somewhere, and instead of dumping it into space where it's going to create a hazard along with all the other space junk that we have up there, the Cygnus serves very well as kind of an orbiting trash can that burns up in the atmosphere, which is kind of handy because it looks like a trash can. However, that's going to be replaced fairly soon as well by something attached to the Sierra Nevada Dream Chaser. The Shooting Star spacecraft, and yes, it is a spacecraft complete with solar panels and engines on the back of the Sierra Nevada Dream Chaser, can also serve as a trash can for the astronauts. So really, this can replace the Cygnus as far as that use is concerned. So really, the Cygnus has the one advantage of increased pressurized volume. Other than that, once the Dream Chaser is introduced, the Cygnus will have no function whatsoever, and I think NASA is going to have to take a really hard look as to how often they're going to have to make use of that pressurized volume on the Cygnus and whether or not it's worth the expense. Now, there is one more important use for the Cygnus, or rather an upgraded and upgunned version of the Cygnus, and that's the HALO, or Habitation and Logistics Outpost module of the Lunar Gateway. So that's right, guys. The astronauts orbiting the moon on the Lunar Gateway are going to be living inside a trash can. Now, how Northrop got this contract after ripping NASA off for so many hundreds of millions of dollars is beyond me, but they got it, and so it gives another use for the Cygnus and a reason to continue using this spacecraft, although in my opinion, it should be used as little as possible, and instead of flying on top of an overpriced Northrop rocket, it should fly on this. Now, granted, it's going to make the executives at Northrop angry enough to chew titanium to use one of their arch rivals' rockets to send one of their spacecraft into orbit, but NASA is the one paying for these contracts, and they can set the conditions. There is no reason that the Falcon 9 cannot carry the Cygnus to the ISS. No reason whatsoever. It has a large enough fairing, and it can carry enough payload. And ironically enough, the Cygnus that's going to be the HALO for the Lunar Gateway, that is going to weigh so much that a Falcon Heavy is the only rocket that we currently possess that's going to be able to carry it all the way to cislunar space. And if doing business with SpaceX makes Northrop too queasy, then they can do business with these guys. Granted, the Vulcan, when it first comes out, is not going to be reusable, but reusability is in its future, in its very near future, as a matter of fact. The upper stage will be reusable as a space tug, and the engines will be reusable due to a parafoil recovery called Smart Recovery that allows the first stage to use all of the propellant and without having to save any in reserve to land the first stage. A pretty innovative way of recovering engines, in my opinion. So I'm not saying that ULA is the best solution, but they're a better solution than the Antares, and they're at least trying to embrace reusability. So SpaceX or maybe ULA, definitely not the Antares, and yet that's exactly what we have scheduled for all future launches of the Cygnus through 2023. When are we going to stop this? When NASA decides that going back to the moon is more important than placating their good old buddies at Northrop who have been ripping them off for far too long. So, at the end of the day, what are we really looking to do here? What should NASA be doing? What should their policy be as far as launch providers are concerned? Well, I think it's really simple, and I hope that this video has made it simple. Companies that are not trying to pursue some form of reusability, some method of reducing the cost of getting payloads into orbit should not receive any future contracts from NASA. Period. NASA had an opportunity to do this with the Antares after the first 10 missions, their first contract with them, and yet now they're obligated to more launches in another contract. Why was this done? The Antares has not been employed by any other organization, as I said in the video. No company is going to pay that much money to take that little payload to orbit anymore, not when they have better options. This is something that any launch provider needs to realize, and this is something that any launch provider needs to address if they want to remain competitive and if they want to keep getting contracts. But that's not really the case, is it? As long as you have powerful enough friends at NASA and powerful enough friends in the government, you are going to continue receiving contracts from NASA, regardless of how wasteful your systems are. I've always been angry about that and will remain angry about it, especially given how little of a percentage of the government budget is spent on space and what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to get back to the damn moon. That being the case, we cannot be using these wasteful launch providers anymore. Now, maybe the Cygnus is needed, its volume is needed for certain types of payloads, but personally, I think we could probably use it a whole lot less. And absolutely, it could be launched on a reusable rocket. Perhaps the Falcon 9 or the Falcon Heavy if it's a particularly large amount of cargo, and it would still be a less expensive solution. But that's not what NASA is doing consistently, and they need to start doing it. And ULA, at least, is recognizing this issue, and that's why they have plans for reusability involved with the Vulcan. So if you're a launch provider that's at least trying to embrace reusability, I think that at least earns you some kind of credibility with NASA. If you're not even bothering, you shouldn't get one damn contract at all. Let's see what happens in the future, but I have a feeling that that principle is not going to apply no matter what happens as time goes on. If you like what I have to say, if you also feel that companies need to be embracing reusability as a whole, or at least embracing innovation to reduce the cost of going to space. If you like these kinds of principles as well, you know how to support me. It's all in the description in many different ways to keep my channel going, or just a simple like and a subscribe, and I'll be very happy. So until NASA embraces a complete and comprehensive policy to never allow a launch provider to send up one of their missions unless they're at least trying to embrace reusability, until they start doing this with every single launch provider without exception, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.